Hello, and welcome to a lock-in at the Crate and Crowbar, where today we're going to be talking about Midnight Mass, the Mike Flanagan horror opus. I'm Jamie Britton, and with me today to discuss all things Midnight Massy is Chris Thurston. Hello, Chris.
Hi, hello. And as if on cue, right at the beginning of recording this, because we're recording this during the day, which is unusual, my neighbours actually just started hammering on the wall. So if you hear an unsettling thumping sound throughout this podcast, it's probably my RTX noise cancellation failing to eliminate my neighbour, or it's coming from inside your own house, as the case may be. This is the first time you and I have done a TV pod, Jamie.
Yes, I'm very excited to be here. It's very strange when you've heard someone talk in your ears for probably many hundreds of hours, and then you're suddenly in conversation with them. It feels very natural to me. It must feel quite weird to you, but
it's strange being me all of the time. So I sympathise. Strange listening to me. Strange hearing these things come out of my mouth as they are right now. This moment is strange. I really am launching into maybe a 4 to 5 minute monologue here, which will go somewhere, I promise, towards the end, and it'll be very poignant.
Presumably Zencaster can't deal with existential crisis. It can't flatten those out.
You can't stare directly into the lens of Zencaster, partly because we're not using webcams. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'm really excited to talk about Midnight Mass. And I appreciate that this, we've done a few things with these lock-ins. And so far as we've at least approached TV and film, we've definitely approached some of like the big genre, media of the moment, both through Dune and then obviously last time with Deep Space Nine that you all did. Midnight Mass I anticipate being a little bit different because I don't expect that a lot of people have watched it necessarily. I think it was very popular on Netflix. It's a Netflix show, but nonetheless not probably on the scale of like a big sci-fi adaptation or Star Trek as an entity. And so I did want to say at the top of this kind of what the show is, why I've chosen to talk about it, and then also the kind of spoiler warning to end all spoiler warnings, really. So Mike Flanagan has now produced several of these sort of big ensemble horror opuses, as you put it, for Netflix and generally. So Haunting of Hill House, Haunting of Bly Manor, and now Midnight Mass. And I will say that I think Midnight Mass for me is probably my favorite bit of screen media this year. I really, really, really enjoyed it a lot. And I'm really excited to talk about it, which is one of the reasons that I want to talk about it and TV horror and all the things that kind of arise from it. However, I benefited enormously, as I have with his other shows as well, from going in really not knowing anything about it. And specifically, I think Midnight Mass is quite spoilable. So much so that even encountering it on like a pop culture website or something has the power to probably ruin parts of it. So consider this a really big spoiler warning. I would say, and I actually would like to get your take on this as well, Jamie. Like, for me, I think it is a really kind of rich and intelligent use of TV for horror that I enjoyed enormously, and I got a lot out of, both from a kind of horror fan perspective and just from a fan of sort of like performance and rich atmospheric television making. And I would recommend anyone who's interested in those things and willing to put up with a few spooks to watch it and know nothing about it. And also now, therefore, to stop listening to this momentarily. But how about you? How would you approach it from a spoiler-free summary or recommendation?
Yeah, I would probably agree with you that it was certainly among the best things I saw on a TV this year. I find the streaming age of television completely exhausting and completely overwhelming, and so I'm often deciding not to watch things because they feel like too much of an imposition on an already fragile brain. But once I started off on Midnight Mass, I was really taken with it, and I think it's really good, and it's a really singular, independent piece of work that doesn't have any kind of stuff around it. It gives you everything you need in a relatively short package. So yeah, I would, if people are listening to this and they haven't seen it, I would urge them to watch it because it is dead good.
Yeah.
And I was really pleased that I had no idea what was going on when I went in. And yeah, if you Google it, you'll probably spoil it because SEO doesn't care for your unspoiled brain.
I suspect Netflix's algorithm could spoil it at this point. Just, if you can, maybe get a family member or a pet to use your Netflix for you, and then sit there for 9 hours, and then you can come back and listen to us talk about it. It might be worth maybe this side of whatever spoiler break we put in as well, talking a little bit about how we ourselves kind of came to encounter this. Am I right in saying this is the first of the kind of Mike Flanagan horror oeuvre that you've encountered, Jamie?
Yes, I think this is. I'd seen his film. I'd seen Gerald's Game, based on the Stephen King novel, and I think we'll probably end up talking about Stephen King quite a bit in this. And I'd enjoyed it. I thought it was a solid adaptation of one of Stephen King's least adaptable books, probably. Although that's never stopped anyone from trying, has it? Either way, I thought it was good and interesting. I think the snob in me had decided that Mike Flanagan wasn't for me, because I'd seen the terms. I don't even know what I'd seen, just through osmosis and the way people were talking about Haunting of Hill House and Haunting of Bly Manor. I think there was a nasty critical, genre snob in me who thought, oh, who is this, pretender coming here pretending to bring literary values to the horror genre? No, thank you. And then having watched Midnight Mass and a little bit of those other shows, I realized, oh no, it's not the bad version of that. It's the good version,
Right.
So yeah, that was my experience before.
So for me, I hadn't actually seen anything of his until Bly Manor came out last year, and then I watched sort of inhaled Bly Manor, which is very much a successor to Hill House, which I then subsequently went and watched. But both of those shows I would also recommend. And both of them are constructed in a similar way, although Bly Manor, we're talking about literary horror, Bly Manor is quite specifically, at least starts out as an adaptation of The Turning of the Screw. The Turn of the Screw, and then sort of branches into different sort of areas of Henry James in its kind of like scope, but very much goes in its own direction when it wants to. And in both cases, what I admired about it was partly that sort of literary sense. But I would probably take it a little bit separately, and it'd be interesting to maybe to unpack this as it relates to Midnight Mass when we're on the other side of the spoiler wall. But I agree with you that there's both a kind of strong literary influence, but also I think a really strong theatrical influence, particularly like not just as adaptation but as dramatization of these books, and the way that its particular approach to performance, which is very heavy on ensembles, but ensembles made up of very rich individual parts, almost like a huge favor is being done to every single actor in these shows. Like, you don't get to be in a Mike Flanagan show and not get given a real opportunity to swing for the fences, with a rich character moment or a monologue or something, which I had also seen attract some fairly cynical criticism. But maybe sometimes I enjoy as a guilty pleasure, but I do nonetheless really enjoy, and I find it quite unusual as approach to TV. It's not strictly naturalistic performance a lot of the time. It's very, as I say, it can be stagey, but it can also be sort of very richly sort of stylized in a way that I find quite effective. And then particularly in the context of those shows, Bly Manor and Hill House, shows that are constructed almost as like mystery box, but not in the bad way, sort of like sort of tours of these environments where you have these closed environments, and those, in both cases, haunted houses, that are so kind of rich in detail and blink or you'll miss it. Clues and sort of this sort of like almost like contraption of the thing is so ornate that it then kind of keeps you kind of alert and focused constantly throughout these very rich kind of horror experiences in a way that I think brings out the best in its more kind of literary or kind of dramaturgical aspirations, and sets you up to shit yourself inside out when he decides to do a big boo. Yeah. And these are the two, this is the yin and the yang of these experiences. Yes. Getting a bit weepy because of a meaningful character beat, and then having a heart attack minutes later. It's two different ways of interacting with the human heart, I believe.
Absolutely. It's funny because you're absolutely right. He does kind of break a fairly fundamental rule of television, really, which is to have characters basically arrive in the show, they say, "Hi, my name is Steve, and this is my deal. This is what I'm about, and I'm going to talk for a very long time about what I'm about and where I'm coming from, and I'm going to do this several times over the course of this series of television, and you're just going to sit there and listen to it. There's not going to really be any crosstalk or interrogation of this. I'm just going to say my thing. And normally that is, if you take any writing course or screenwriting course or anything like that, show don't tell, it's pretty high up the board of the guy standing at the front of the classroom pretending he knows what he's talking about with these things. And it's really nice to see it done. It is a theatrical sort of, people do that in plays a lot because they have to, because, there aren't bombs going off or guns to shoot necessarily all the time in a movie. So you have to fill that space with monologues. And yeah, it's funny that people talk about Midnight Mass and they say it's ponderous and slow or sentimental, all the kind of bad vibes that kind of get slung its way, and I just disagree with all of them. I think the effect is actually magical. It's heartfelt. Even you could use the word melodramatic, but at no point does it seem insincere or untruthful or disparate from my own experiences of existence.
Right. Well, I think that's the thing, and for me, it's like something I really like about all of these shows. Before we get into Midnight specifically, is almost like the openness with which characters express themselves. It's like everyone in this universe has been granted the confidence and eloquence that you believe that you have when it is 2 a.m. at a house party in university, and the conch has arrived in your lap, and it's time to just explain life to the person sat next to you, right? And you're probably in reality talking complete bollocks, but in your head, it sounds very profound, or what they're saying to you sounds very profound. Maybe that is a very specific experience of mine that I'm projecting onto these shows, but it has that sense of like sudden intimacy with someone's interior life, albeit in quite a stagey and kind of larger than life way, that feels to me quite like generous. Like it feels like a generosity of sentiment rather than something you should shy away from because it is sentimental. And I think sometimes it speaks to the reaction it receives speaks to an aversion to just sort of like, maybe this is too much by me, but if an aversion to eloquent sort of openness on the part of characters that we would rather emotion, like the sort of interiority go kind of unexplained or kind of gestured at, and therefore kind of left sort of comfortably far away, so we don't really need to encounter it, don't really need to cringe away from the sort of literally both the expository nature of that stuff, but also how much it exposes about those characters in those moments. Whereas I think for me, in the way that's where not just theatrical, but it's almost like operatic sometimes, right? Like I'm not just going to tell you what my deal is. I'm gonna really perform it, and that I think is actually like for me quite refreshing in an era of naturalistic portrayals of emotion, particularly I think of maybe this is going a bit too far, but we can get into it with Midnight Mass specifically, of like emotions as experienced by men, where we're in a lot of the time in our kind of prestige TV, we're looking for performances of the unsaid rather than the painstakingly articulated directly into someone else's eyes.
Yeah. And I would also say that it is it's one of the elements of Stephen King's writing, which I think is often adapted very successfully in his non kind of horror sort of thing. So like Shawshank Redemption or The Green Mile or Stand By Me all have that similar level of emotional heat and passion to them that I think is the thing that is often undersold about Stephen King's writing when people are talking about him as a master of horror. If you look at something of his like It, which this draws from, or Under the Dome, actually, which is a book I really like by him, they have this level of emotional sort of size to them of mass, Midnight Mass, which is is really something, and I think is something he does really well as a writer that people often overlook. And I think Mike Flanagan engages with that and turns it into something kind of new, which I think is super exciting about him, what he's going to come up with next as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's also. I feel like we're getting quite a lot of there's a lot of red meat on the subject of just why this works without getting into the spoilers, actually. But I think it's also has a really crucial relationship with horror as a genre. Like, not every Stephen King novel you mentioned there is like strictly horror, or like or is a horror novel at all, actually necessarily. And but I think there's a reason that these shows work because they're horror shows in addition to being sort of genre horror shows as well. And it's because I think they identify something that I've always loved about horror, which is it is a way to kind of fully expose in a safe environment the uncomfortable sides of our own sort of feelings and anxieties and play them up. And, one thing that's really crucial, I think, and there's a lot of repeated themes in his work, particularly when it comes to things like families falling apart, addiction, love, and these things being felt very, very keenly by the people encountering them, and how this, particularly in Hill House, without spoilers for Hill House or Bly Manor, particularly as it imposes on those shows, that are sort of that is what ghosts are in those shows to a greater or lesser extent. That it uses the medium of a ghost story to take that dramatization of the interior lives of those characters even further, right? To project those traumas and emotions and what they represent into the world in terms of a tangible/intangible threat. And that for me is sort of, that's always been true of horror, right? To a greater or lesser extent. But I think these shows for me make a really, really strong case for why that's not just a kind of fun thing to experience as a genre piece, but also like a really valid dramatic technique when it comes to kind of really, really getting into this, as you say, kind of emotional heat and enjoying being present in that environment.
Yeah, it's something kind of particular about horror. And I think it's a big theme in this show as well of like, you get from it what you take to it. Horror films, a particular horror film will work on someone that on one person that it doesn't work on another because they don't have the same set of fears. And the books that he's adapted, Turn of the Screw, which I read relatively recently. I've always hated Henry James as a writer because he forced to read him at university. But then I read Turn of the Screw and I was like, wow, what a knockout book! Like and it's about that. It's about like the horror you bring to a frightening situation and what that means specifically for you as a human being, and why it's the sort of existential nature of horror, and the ambiguity in that, which he draws, Henry James at least draws superbly. And I think again, Midnight Mass is of a piece of that because it is about kind of the liquid takes the shape of the chalice.
Right.
Things are interpreted through humans, and supernatural elements are interpreted through humans in the way that is significant to them and is particular to them.
And I think it's also the great success of this ensemble format, which has been the case across these shows, is it's not just one person's perspective on whatever it is that's going on. Obviously, at this point, we're still avoiding spoilers. It's like they're very dramatically rich, these shows, I think, because they give you multiple ways into and out, multiple conclusions out of these scenarios at the same time from multiple viewpoints. And this is also very relevant to Midnight Mass. Therefore, I think become like quite a rich sort of like overall fabric, right, of responses that doesn't necessarily foreground one or another as correct, but gives you a kind of, I think, quite a kind of, or gave me at least, quite a kind of touching sense of the interconnectedness of these interpretations as well, rather than the sort of a horror perspective being one that like we're ultimately isolated from one another by these unique encounters with our own lives, with whatever we carry with us, whatever we bring with us, as you say. There's actually one of the show's messages, and I would actually argue one of the messages of all of these shows to some extent is this is not a isolated experience, even if it is isolating. That this sort of horror reality, this sort of shared pain is actually something that unites as well. And that's actually like, I find them strangely optimistic, as horrible as they can be, which is quite a nice thing. And like, actually, I think despite the subject matter a lot of the time, not nihilistic either, right? Like it doesn't tend towards this position of of uh, doom and isolation, but actually towards a greater sense of humanity, which is quite, well, for me, I think quite affecting, and not something I necessarily expect to get from a spooky show about things going boo.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those shows where after it finished, I kind of, I think the very best TV can do this, where you just sort of you feel it in your heart for a while. You carry it with you. I remember when 6 Feet Under ended, and I remember walking down from my student flat to town, having just watched that, and just feeling like kind of heartbroken and joyous at the same time. And I felt the same way with Twin Peaks: The Return, and I felt the same way with Midnight Mass too. It's like these things can really, and books and movie and everything can do it, but like it's rare in TV, I think, because there's often too much of it, of too low quality, or getting to the end of one of these shows is a slog. And Midnight Mass just kind of, it's a show about meaning, and it's a show about big stuff, and it goes places, and I appreciate the ambition of it and the scope of it for that.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I watched Midnight Mass. Is a lot of these horror shows I kind of watch by myself, and I tend to watch them early in the morning before work, because that's kind of the time I have for like an hour of TV or something. And I watched Midnight Mass over the course of about a week and a half, I think, quite early in the morning. And the day after finishing it had that sort of slightly, had that kind of post-good art shimmer to it, which is something that you don't get all the time. And it stayed on my mind. And actually, in preparation, I finished it about a month ago. And in preparation for recording today, I went back and this morning before work early rewatched chunks of it. And it was nice to reconnect to it and sort of actually come away from it, watching the final moments of the show again as well, like actually come away from it almost with the afterglow of that same effect, which is, I think, a testament to how good it is, actually. I think maybe before we break onto the other side of the spoiler wall and actually just start talking about the episode by episode, we should maybe give a brief premise for Midnight Mass, but I almost don't know where to start. Maybe the way I would start somebody is like, it takes what is very enclosed and family based about the haunted house shows, both of the haunting ofs, and expands it to a larger community, but a nonetheless very isolated one, an isolated fishing community off the coast of New England. In the modern day, following several characters returning to this island, and the kind of their interconnected relationships with one another, their relationships with grief and the things that they have brought with them, the isolated nature of that community, and the role that faith, particularly powerful faith, plays in that community, in the way that it kind of binds and isolates individual people. And then stuff happens that I won't talk about. Was there anything I've missed, do you think, that you would use to kind of sell it to someone without saying any of the forbidden words?
No, I would say that's about right. Yeah.
Cool. Well, in that case, if you haven't watched it and we've sold you on it, please, please, please stop listening now and just don't Google it. Just, like I say, find some way to enter a fugue state, and when your eyes open again, you are watching Midnight Mass. When you've done that, come back. I feel like we should put some sort of like noise here or something, or maybe just a big jump scare to kind of frighten people away from the other side of the spoilers. But nonetheless, let's just get into it. From this point onwards, we're going to say forbidden words.
So I was taken by your forbidden words. I was like, maybe they're all forbidden words.
Yeah, they're all forbidden words. Wait. So should we just start at the start and talk through it?
Yeah, definitely. So the episodes are all named after books of the Bible, which is very metal. I couldn't help thinking it was like
metal.
Lamb of God album name titles or something like that.
Midnight Mass is a great band name.
It is. It is, yeah. It's almost Candlemas, Doom Metal Heroes Candlemas.
True.
That's true. So in the first episode, we meet Riley Flynn, and I think the episode begins with a flashback to him murdering someone with his car whilst drink driving, which gives him his kind of sort of fundamental pain that he's dealing with. And he's our kind of audience surrogate for the first sort of act of the show, or the first half of the show, I guess. and he's sort of lost his faith, and he's kind of coming back to his family, and sort of meeting his childhood sweetheart and his brother, his younger brother, his parents, one of whom's played by the kid from E.T., which blew my mind entirely when I realised who that was.
Yeah,
Henry
I had that
Thomas.
after Blind Manor.
And yeah, we're basically just sort of introduced to this Crockett Island, the Crock Pot, they call it, this sort of slightly doomed fishing hamlet. Very, very slow burn first episode, I'd say. Like, really very little happens in it. And for me, coming to this as my first sort of Flanagan, sort of horror show type thing, I found it kind of perfumed and kind of really intriguing, actually. It felt like a very purposeful but very, very slow opening act to something very interesting indeed.
Yeah, I think coming to it with a bit more experience, I found like I have the same sense of I was kind of immediately in, I think, and I think there's because of the way these shows are constructed, I had that sense maybe you wouldn't have had that, like every single part of this ensemble is going to be significant, and every detail in this, because you're right, nothing really happens, but it is littered with detail, right? It is almost, that you're watching a horror show. It is almost baiting you to start reading into these details. And I think something that I want to get to say in Midnight Mass, but we'll get there, is I think that concept of reading into the signs and symbols that you're seeing is a hugely important theme. And it kind of starts right away as this cast of characters is introduced, the interrelationships, the implied conflicts, the sense that this town has undergone a serious tragedy in the sense of this oil spill, and then the subsequent kind of like the fact that its population is rapidly dwindling, and it kind of invites you to start trying to identify where the horror is going to come from in this place, even as it feels like as you say, a kind of doomed and foreboding place already. This notion of a storm coming, which is very literally true in the first episode. And I think also the way it then litters these small moments, like it's not without its scares, right? This first episode, it has the kind of sudden shocking appearance of the young woman that Riley killed, who is kind of haunts him, quite literally. It has the appearance of something out on is it the Narrows? The kind of like the smaller island covered in cats that the teenagers row out to smoke weed. The appearance of something there. It has Riley see something on the beach, but gives you no answers about any of this. And something I would also append to this is I love the choice of a New England fishing hamlet for this, because at least in like American horror, that leaves the door extremely open within the kind of Stephen King-iverse for almost anything to happen next. Whether that's, going to be built around the kind of religious terror implied by this charismatic new priest, whether it's a monster, whether it's something from the sea in a more Lovecraftian sense, like all of that stuff is kind of left there in front of you with almost none of it happening, which I really like.
Yes, extraordinary. And actually, because it's another way that the show really uses and really mobilizes its characters to a theme, in that everyone in the show feels human. Everyone feels human. No one feels like there's one character who does feel like the villain of the piece, and she sort of does turn out to be that, Bev, who I think is probably the show's least successful character, because I think she's very much required to be there, but I think she's a little bit too close to the character from The Mist, played by Marcia Gay Harden. I think she slightly suffers from that, but we'll get there. Either way, everyone we meet is a human being with faults, and there's an awkward dinner scene at home, but the people don't seem caricatured in any sense, and they don't seem like easy archetypes, really, which is very unnerving. And I think the New England setting really helps for that, because if this was like the Deep South, or Hunt Showdown Land. There'd be all sorts of stuff hiding in, rusty barns and lots of rednecks, toting shotguns and stuff like that. But it really does set you on edge to be like, well, this is just an island of relatively reasonable, God-fearing folk who look out for each other, and have a Middle Eastern guy as their sheriff. It's kind of it's as you say, it is an unusual opening salvo because of what's missing.
Yeah, and I think something I find, I feel like we'll need to keep talking about Bev. But one thing I think one of the reasons I like Bev in this, but I think particularly because as you learn more and more about her, she has her own complexities, but also she is the person who is most sort of caricatured themselves in a way. And I think a theme that is introduced here is this relationship between text, and particularly the Bible, and who you are. And how, and the fact that even in this God-fearing community, there is a ton of meaningful diversity of perspectives and relationships with that faith. Like, yes, they're God-fearing people that look out for each other, but they're also God-fearing people who have mostly welcomed a Muslim police officer into their midst. Mostly, I want to draw out that a little bit more as we get into it, as it's kind of explored further in the show, because I think it's a big success of the show. But it doesn't, as you say, lean into more kind of hard divides between people. The character, the town drunk as well, a sympathetic character, someone who's also kind of interlinked. The fact that the characters show up in different contexts. So the organist from the church is also kind of, a kind of handyman around the town. These sorts of, actually, they're not quite the same character, but you know what I mean? That kind of like intermingling of all of these things in that Crock Pot, as they put it, as a way of sort of defying the hard lines imposed on people by text and textuality, and in this case both the script and the script of faith that some people follow more rigidly than others, notably Bev, who renders herself almost sort of cartoonish at times, as a consequence of that strongly didactic attitude, which I find a really interesting balance of things to introduce, particularly as you're inviting the audience to wonder about the genre that this is actually ultimately going to fit into.
Yes, absolutely. And she's I think in this early episode we get a sense of how the island has kind of sold out after this oil spill, and that she's been a kind of agent in collecting money from that for her church, sort of replacing fish with God, which I think is fascinating for her to sort of start with. And then of the sort of other thing that's happening in this episode is we're meeting Father Paul Hill, played by Hamish Linklater, who I just can't talk enough sugar about. I just think he's fantastic.
Yeah.
All over this show, in a show full of absolutely superb performances. I think he's my favourite. He's popped up in a few things over the years. Legion, I think he's very good in as well. But yeah, he kind of turns up with actually quite little ceremony. When I was watching this, I didn't know that he was going to be kind of our main guy, that and I was surprised when he became that. I thought, oh, this is this cool priest who's going to be this kind of player in what's going to unfold. I didn't necessarily realize that he is in fact the whole mystery, and he is responsible for everything that's going to unfold.
Yeah, totally. It's such a good performance. We should definitely keep returning to Hamish Linklater, because he is the heart of the show. But also I think that effect of him, sort of the surprise of him, is something the show orchestrates quite deliberately. Like, it, there's multiple scenes in the first episode of, Bev excited to go meet, she's expecting the former priest, Monsignor Pruitt, and this man does not show up. Like there's sort of there's like scenes of people missing each other and absences. And then suddenly here is this man out of nowhere in the center of this, very much in the center of this island in the church. And you are kind of put alongside the characters of the show in that moment, at kind of getting used to the idea that in and among this sort of intercollected ensemble, there is now someone new who, as you say, is going to be both the motivating mystery, but also like doesn't quite fit. and there are so many lovely little details, both through his like priestly vestments and everything else to indicate those little moments of incompatibility that start as these little sort of nits that keep you from being fully comfortable with this person, and then that is only going to grow and grow and grow till you realize, oh, that's the show. that's what this is actually about. And I think that's really clever. And then at the end of the episode, to bring us into the next one, and the amazing opening scene in the next episode, you get something completely left field. You get a beach covered in dead cats, and I love that misdirect to the extent that it is.
Yes, it's brilliant. I had no idea. I had literally no idea that was coming. I mean, we've seen a sort of figure. There's something flies through the sky earlier on the way towards where those cats are, but we don't see it. And I was kind of, I had no idea, what this meant and what those dead cats were going to signify. And yes, in the second episode, Psalms, it does begin with an absolutely, I thought, spectacular opening scene, which is the dead cats on the beach and more or less every character from the show coming onto the beach to kind of discuss it and talk about it and kind of, introduce who they are. It's all done in a pretty much, I think, single unbroken take.
I rewatched it this morning. It's an 8-minute single take.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And I couldn't see any cheats in it, I don't think. It just looked like a real, one. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is also, I think that's the scene that also fundamentally it follows. I appreciate it all the more watching it a second time. It follows the sheriff, Hassan Rahul Kohli's character, and this is really your first full introduction to him as a character. He's in the first episode as well, obviously, but this actually maybe I'm wrong in saying this is his introduction. I feel like this is like the first kind of full articulation of his role in the town. Particularly because the largest part of the scene is his conversation with the mayor. And it's such a great and pretty subtle articulation of the relationship between these two men who share ostensibly responsibility for this town and its people. And the particular personality of the mayor, the areas where he overreaches in kind of requesting that the sheriff make an appearance at mass, even if it's not as a convert, is his exact words. And the friendliness and the gentle probing, and then the fact that as they walk down the beach together and in one take it flows into another conversation with another group of people, the sheriff starts to repeat the same anecdote to this new set in his attempt to kind of like explain everything away and calm everything. And it felt that I just love that kind of again, one of those things that feels quite uncomfortable but also very human. You're very much put in Hassan's shoes there as he is sort of humoring this man who is himself trying to humor everybody else, and you see the kind of the performativeness of that repeated anecdote and the kind of uncomfortableness of being present twice for someone else's story. And then the scene literally hands focus over to Riley as soon as he is introduced, and he is the other outsider really in that scene, right? He's the other person who very much explicitly doesn't know where he fits. And then it doesn't end until Riley is with Erin, and his sort of childhood love interest, and one of the show's other kind of very important vocal voices. This woman who grew up on the island, basically ran away for most of her adult life and has returned pregnant. And the subject of speculation and gossip, etc. And in doing so, it does this brilliant job of having, as you say, an enormous part of the important cast of the show appear to kind of consider this mysterious, very strange, unsettling event. But it keeps the focus between a set of characters in Sheriff Hassan, Riley, and Erin, who are all going to be really key to the whose status as outsiders is ultimately going to be really key to how this whole thing resolves. And I think it's just such a great thing to rewatch in the light of particularly what's coming next as well.
Yes, and there is something magic, I think is maybe the right word, about essentially seeing a play on a beach. Right. That feels unusual. A camera floating around in that space with a bunch of dead cats on the ground. It feels sort of impossible. And gives our characters a kind of backdrop, a setting. It almost makes me think a bit like those Lars von Trier movies he did, like Mandalay and all that sort of stuff, where there's chalk outlines on the ground instead of sets, where it's kind of, he's giving us a backdrop, he's given us a setting against which impossible things are going to happen, because it kind of feels kind of unholy to be in this space with these people looking at what they're looking at. It's an uncanniness, but very, very subtly kind of introduced.
And then the rest of this episode, actually, it's funny going back over summaries of these episodes, because I think I forget how much actually does happen in episodes 2 and 3, and yet how slow they feel at the same time, which is an interesting trick.
Yes, we've got kind of we meet a whole bunch of kind of new people. Lisa Scarborough, who is the wheelchair-bound daughter of the mayor, who was paralyzed after being shot by the town drunk Joe Colley, who becomes a kind of pretty important character. I mean, I say she becomes, they're all kind of important characters. It's funny, no one really drops away. And then we have the big potluck festival, the big event, and that's when Joe's dog dies. And that, again, like Joe, a character, the town drunk, would often be an easy fix of a character, an easy thing to discard, but they make him so human and whole. And so you sort of know him as soon as you see him, and when he weeps for his dog, you kind of weep with him. It's brutally sad, what happens to him. And obviously everyone suspects Bev.
It was Bev.
Well, it just was Bev, yes. We're right to suspect it because it was her. Dog murderer Bev.
I quite like that as well. I like that as well. It's like so transparently her. You see her playing with rat poison in the school. She's ostensibly putting it out to get rid of whatever killed the cats or whatever kind of contagion is creeping on the island. You basically see the hem of her dress as a hand gives the dog a hot dog. You see every part of her kill this dog.
Yeah, I kind of forgot that. That's brutal.
Yeah. and I like the fact that, but again, the show's still in this mode where it's, something is coming. The storm passed the night before, but it's only getting stranger. And then you have this explosion of real heart-wrenching grief for this dog from Joe Colley. If the dog's death is horrible, like they're watching, it have a fit and die. So you have this moment of like very hot emotion, to take the kind of the word you had earlier, but you still don't really know what's going on, except you do know that this sort of awful, exclusionary zealot has clearly killed this man's dog. Like, she's clearly done it, but that is not where we're going dramatically, right? We almost move on past that. That becomes part of, again, the kind of like fabric of kind of, grief and pain. And you start to see some of the discord within that interrelated weave of people that the show has kind of introduced in the first episode.
And this kind of, it also introduces this sort of, with her in particular, this theme of like, religion can be ugly, religion can be bad, it can hurt people, it causes terrible pain, and it's a very cynical view of religion, which is also a very, in a certain light, true view of religion, I think, in the, depending on how you interpret it, you can sanction, great evil. I mean, it sounds like a very pat thing to say, but it is kind of here, isn't it? It's sort of pretty key to this show.
Right. And this is also the episode where, Riley has to attend AA meetings as part of his parole. He's, been released from prison. And to save him the trip to the mainland, Father Paul invites him to start attending essentially one-on-one AA meetings.
What a nightmare.
In Bev's rec center. And these scenes, which are, I think, great, like all of the kind of Paul and Riley scenes, are these effectively like little debates at the heart of the show, particularly this first one about faith and about, Paul, who is at this point established as this kind of wonderful preacher. And those scenes of, the Ash Wednesday ceremony are so kind of beautifully detailed. And actually, even as the show through Bev shows some of the pain that can be excused through organized religion in this particular context, or through faith used as a defense for pretty abominable actions, it also has a really powerful sense of essentially the healing or restorative power of, collective belief and religious ceremony. And then as this episode ends, literally manifests that when, the first miracle occurs. And at Mass, I love this moment, and I don't want to skip ahead if you want to talk about the bulk of this episode, but the last scene of the episode where during Mass, Father Paul seems to have noticed something about Lisa, the wheelchair-bound girl, and invites her to stand. And the thing I love about this is how uncomfortable it makes everybody in the room, right? Seeing her parents get into like this sort of, who are starting to really warm to this charismatic young priest, look deeply offended and betrayed by this, right? It is a performative step too far. It's deeply unfair and cruel, but in not a kind of extravagant horror way, in a very human, for me, it has the actual knot of terror of like doing a real faux pas. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like deeply stepping wrong socially. And you see that all kind of coalesce for a moment to the point where it becomes unbearable. And then she stands up and starts to walk towards him, and she is free of her wheelchair. And it's such a lovely, horrible, and then sort of miraculous articulation of all the different emotions in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. And I think in this episode, the Ash Wednesday scene, that kind of, there's two church scenes. There's the scene where she, during Mass, and then there's a scene sort of halfway through the episode where he does this, because in talking about Bev, the sort of evil is as evil does kind of view of religion. But actually, another thing the show does really well, amazingly, is capture what's great about religion. The things that are sort of inarguably wonderful about it. And he does a speech about the Psalms. He says, what Psalms are? They're songs. In the absence of light and hope, we sing to the sky that God will restore us. And he also talks about how Jesus's first disciples, they were fishermen. It's a young man's body with an older man's fervor, and what it gives us is, I kind of felt a kind of leaping sense in almost like I was watching the end of Whiplash. Kind of the end of Whiplash sort of induces euphoria in you. That final scene, and in these preaching scenes, I think Hamish Linklater does an extraordinary trick in old man wisdom, young man's body, something weird's going on, and he's producing something really magical. And then that's paid off in that final scene where you've been taken in by him, you've been charmed by him, and then he's like, doing Alan Partridge or something to get this girl to walk. And then she does. And I think the unease that is generated there is pitch perfect.
And I think what's really key about it is that unease, that something sort of wonderful has happened. And over the course of this show, you've been drawn into the restorative power of this person's performance. And I think what, we draw it out as a performance by Hamish Linklater, and actually absolutely is. It is also, very crucially, as we're going to discover in the next episode, a performance by Paul, right? It is a performance by Paul Hill, a character that is being played by another character. To an extent, and something that's going to be really crucial to this character as the episode goes on is the fact that this is almost everyone in the town wants to forget that this is a performance, and it is, but it is 100% vitally important that it is a performance with multiple layers that is significant to the person performing it for reasons that haven't come to light yet. And as we get into episode 3, I want to take this moment, if I can, and hopefully in not not distracting too much. To dunk briefly on James Delingpole, of all people, who wrote the accidentally funniest and most wrong-headed review of this show of almost anything I think I've ever seen. And I wouldn't normally use the platform of the pod to obviously dunk on someone specifically, but I think it's a wonderful illustration of missing the point of this show as it is being articulated in front of you. So James Delingpole, who I'm not going to link to this in the show notes because I don't really want to drive traffic his way, but he's a conservative commentator who wrote a review for The Spectator, of all fucking places, and additionally said that he was turned on to the show by Ricky Gervais, this is the territory we're in at this point, but has nothing but praise for Midnight Mass, seeing it as a rare thing on woke Netflix, a show that is unapologetically in favor of religion and unapologetically in favor of small communities that support one another and don't need no big government. And more to the point, he manages to be wildly homophobic and racist in the review, points out that its only weaknesses as a show are the plans to multiculturalism indicated by Sheriff Hassan and also by the doctor character who is gay. But aside from these things, he states the show is, and I quote, this is one of the funniest things because it's basically like, you know, those that meme of like photos taken moments before disaster. He anchors the review on this. And I quote, Midnight Mass is unusual in that, so far at least, I'm only 2 and a bit episodes in. It takes Christianity at its own estimation. God is real, miracles do happen, even or especially the most miserable sinners can find redemption through repentance. Watching it is unsettling, he says, 2.5 episodes in, because you keep expecting the rug to be pulled out from under your feet. And, for example, the hero, Father Paul Hill, suddenly to be revealed as an agent of Satan. And wow. I love this. I mean, obviously this is just a column that he's shit out for some reason, but there's, because he goes on to say that obviously, because it's normally the job of clergymen on TV, to expose something of the complexity or hypocrisy of having people with power over people's emotional, spiritual lives. I would love to know what he made of literally the second half of the episode he didn't watch. Because, and the reason I bring all this out, and like I say, I don't take great joy in dunking on this, but one thing I love about this is somebody doing exactly what a lot of the characters in the show will go on to do, which is to take this performance literally as gospel, because that's what they emotionally want and need it to be, right? You know, this person is commentating for hits and against a very particular, you know, trying to use the show as a stick to beat a very particular creative landscape with, which is exactly what people in the show do. The fact that, and this is a testament to Hamish Linklater's performance, the fact that performance is so good and yet so nuanced that it can both invite you to take pleasure and hope and sort of like a restorative sort of salve sort of quality from it, while at the same time being unsettling if you are unsettled by this sort of didacticism. Is such a great trick, and the fact that it has the fact that minutes after the point where this reviewer inexplicably stopped watching the show, he is going to turn out to be, and we might as well just say it at this point, a vampire, is very, very, very funny to me. It's like, it is excellent. This was published in early November, and the headline image for the article is a big picture of Father Paul haloed by the lights of the church, with the caption, "Not since The Exorcist in 1973 has a priest been depicted as an honest-to-God fighter against evil."
Blimey. Way to misunderstand The Exorcist as well.
I know, right? Yeah, exactly.
It's like my mate Hugh, who watches, he'll probably be listening to this, who watches the movie Titanic up to the point just before the iceberg hits, because if you watch it that way, then it's just a lovely movie about a couple falling in love on a non-specific boat, you know.
Anyway, I didn't want to derail us with that, but I love that. Like, I just love that. I think it's a wonderful thing, partly because I've never heard the wah 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 trumpets stronger than the second half of episode 3. But we should get there, because episode 3 begins with the aftermath of this miracle and the religious revival that's about to prompt. But also, crucially, it begins with the first half of a confession scene. We kind of jump backwards in time to see Father Paul enter the confession booth by himself and apologize for the sin he's about to commit, and start telling in impossible detail the story of Father John Pruitt's trip to Jerusalem.
This is Tom Francis Nip. Because as we found out on the Deep Space Nine episode, Tom loves a story which starts at the beginning, starts halfway through, and then goes backwards and forwards to kind of refer back to it. That's this one here. There's one for Tom.
Yeah, exactly. But even as it starts to do its kind of we're going to start explaining now. There's some lovely little devices here, like the wood carvings, like the little woodcuts of, you know, the scenes from Father John Pruitt's life. If the if the interrelationship between performance and one's own actual history wasn't clear enough, we have this literal kind of like this story being carved on tablets as Paul lays it out. But it doesn't quite give you the big V word I just blurted quite at this point.
No, I mean, funnily enough, the show calls it an angel, which is excellent fun.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a really good point. I've said it now. This is a show about vampires. However, it's never going to use the word vampire.
No, it's very much the Shaun of the Dead thing, where it's like we're not using the Z word.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, this episode is the one where everything kind of really kicks off. We get the sort of true story of what happened to Pruitt, where. I mean, the way he finds this vampire, I was wondering, because what happens is he's in Jerusalem, he's caught in a sandstorm, he discovers an ancient ruin where he's attacked by a winged, blood-sucking humanoid creature that then fed him his lifeblood. Again, we're not using the V word, apparently, but there you are. And I was wondering when we were sort of going through this, like, is this like a sort of Lovecraftian thing where this is his interpretation of something more cosmic? Or is this like, a kind of... I was sort of half expecting this to have been shown to be, untrue, or... but no, literally, this is what happened. It's very Indiana Jonesy. He stumbled into an ancient tomb and met a vampire, which gave him his youth, which he then decided to ship back to America with him to bring to this town for various godly reasons.
And ungodly reasons as well. And this is the thing, right? Like, so this episode juxtaposes, because that's the end of the episode, right? Like,
yes.
is him encountering the angel in the cave on the road to Damascus, which is why he subsequently calls himself Paul. I think we've skipped a bit there. Paul is Pruitt. That's the that's the key outcome of this. But the middle of this episode, the meat of it, is very much about the people of the town in the aftermath of this sort of miraculous event. You have Lisa visiting Joe and basically giving him absolution. You have a series of sort of like all scenes that orbit faith but don't necessarily address it directly, right? That really powerful scene of Lisa forgiving Joe for what he did to her. Now she can walk again.
That was incredible. That felt like really felt like a human being pouring sort of everything they are into the scene. This is who I am. This is, like I was saying at the start, this is kind of everything this character has experienced and felt across a lifetime that has been ruined by this guy, and that was just extraordinary.
Yeah, again, that heat of emotion. Then the fact that this religious revival and a desire to be closer to the townspeople and more part of things, as it's put in an earlier episode, brings Sheriff Hassan's son Ali to church and gets him to start studying the Bible. I love that performance as well, because it's clear that it's not just, it's not a conversion story for Ali. It's also like a young man wanting to have friends and meet people and be part of society in this place that his father has kind of dragged him off to. It's again very human. And then the scene at the school where Sheriff Hassan gives a very eloquent articulation of why Bev handing out Bibles at school is not appropriate, and is sort of rebuffed with agonizing patronization from Bev, and then also from the mayor, who is sort of both sidesing this situation in a way that is sort of satisfying for nobody except the most extreme person there, Bev.
I found that scene in particular one of the scariest in the show. Because the sheriff is making such a reasonable case for separation of church and state and religious, cooperation against the backdrop of that. And for Bev to kind of come out and say, but our religion's the real one though, so it's fine. Is essentially what she says. Christianity is true though, so it's not like your silly made up religion. And that felt, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of that about, isn't there, in the world right now? It's kind of, particularly in the age of Trump and stuff like that, these conversations actually do take place in the world. And they, and I found it very scary because as much as, Bev, I think, is sometimes a little bit too big, here, the kind of banality of her fervor, of how polite she is when she cuts him down, I think was very unnerving.
Yeah, and it's the unexamined certainty of a particular kind of I guess I would call it like a malign certainty that she possesses, right? And I think the fact I really liked the show is as kind of brutal as it is in that moment, and the way it allows you set your sympathy to continually settle around the reasonable voices in the room. In this case, Sheriff Hassan, also Aaron, is a consistently reasonable voice, and the way it juxtaposes these sorts of loud, performative, hypocritical voices against the complex interiority characters whose struggles push them to the fringes is a theme that's going to continue both through that trio in a big way. Aaron, Riley, Sheriff Hassan.
And I would say as well that, you know, that one of the reasons the show chimes so well now, I think, in 2021 at the end of it, as a recording, is that the most charitable way you can interpret Trump, I think, and Brexit and COVID denial and vaccine, denial and all that sort of stuff, the most charitable way you can interpret it, not the only way, is that it's people wanting things to be simple. It's people wanting things to be easy. And it's people wanting things to not feel like they have to bear a burden of guilt or complexity. It's so hard to look at oneself and say, actually, there's something about the fact of who I am that means I can't necessarily understand the experiences of people who've had, the same opportunities of me, for example, and Trump is obviously someone who gives glorious, quote unquote, glorious voice to those, terrible insecurities that we have. And I think, again, with Midnight Mass in the last episode and this one particularly, the fact that it can be when someone offers you a light in a storm, you take it, and how open that is to manipulation. And why I think Midnight Mass has been made now really is that I think people are more sort of waking up to that vibe.
Right. And I think that's what's really key about it, because I think what's really, and to get in towards the ending. So then towards the end of this episode, Pruitt/Paul dies. You will kind of get the mechanism of this later, but he functionally starves to death because he hasn't been drinking blood. And when he dies, he is then kind of reborn and now fully in his sort of vampire form. But this is the second miracle, is him coming back to life. And then that leads us into this conclusion where he gets his light in the storm, literally. But his is a vampire in a sandstorm, which is not quite the same thing, except how he interprets it. Right. He interprets vampire in a sandstorm as his, beacon of light, as an angel. And something that I think is really key here and really significant is that, yes, it's sort of odd to get suddenly like a full-on big winged prosthetic Buffy the Vampire ass big old vampy boy right in the middle of your deeply interconnected and sensitive show about faith and relationships and life and trauma and so on. However, one of what it does really successfully, I think, is there'll be a few more mechanisms of vampirism in this particular take on it to learn, but not a lot. Actually, you get a lot of it quite quickly in terms of how this works and how Pruitt understands this works. And actually, and this is later voiced through the Doctor as well, is quite a grounded take on vampirism. So much so that it gives you all the tools you need, with a little bit of hand waving, to understand this as purely a scientific phenomena. Right? It has a particular way it works. Yes, it's unlikely, but it's also kind of self-contained as a kind of an addition to the universe of the show. Like a relatively scientific take on vampirism in an environment that is highly superstitious. And that's really key for me, I think, because it means that the symbolic meaning that these characters are subsequently going to draw from the angel and its revelations, Paul's relationship with it, Pruitt's relationship with it, what he's trying to get out of it, is explicitly in the realm of symbolism, mysticism, existential belief on the part of the characters of the show, not just on the part of us as viewers. And this, I think, answers an issue I have with some of Flanagan's earlier stuff, which is, as I've said, like ghosts in Bly Manor and Hill House are explicitly supernatural manifestations of real trauma, real addictions, betrayals, in fact, tragedies in people's lives. However, they are also literally supernatural beings in this universe. And Blind Manor specifically, not to get into spoilers for Blind Manor, because I do really, really enjoy it. I think in its second half, gets slightly too concerned with the mechanics of ghosts in this universe, and its finale, which I like in many ways, still hinges on you kind of getting this developing understanding of how ghosts work, which for me moves away from the point, which is what ghosts represent. And I think there's a really nice moment here where with Midnight Mass specifically, where actually the supernatural heart of this show, the answer to the big mystery that creeps up on you in the first couple of episodes, which is encouraging all of this interpretive work, is it's the fucking vampire. And that's it, right? It's just, this is the effect of, one big old vampire on this community that was like a powder keg primed for this sort of detonation. Anyway, and in doing so, strangely, despite how much it being a vampire show should dominate your conversation about it as a genre piece, it is almost simply a motivating force that then doesn't take over, actually. And I find that really compelling.
Yes, I would agree, and I think that's very well put. I think there's the thing I think that the show never says out loud, but is everywhere, and it's something I said earlier, is the idea of the blood takes the shape of the chalice. What you pour the sacrament into, it takes that shape. And so into this guy, he's turned, vampirism and being infected by this virus into a gift from God. And I think that is thematically central to the show. In the next episode, we see two characters talk at length about their belief about what happens when you die. This beautiful central scene to the show that the show returns to again. And what you sort of see in that is that there's beauty in the religious interpretation and beauty in the humanistic interpretation. They actually approach the same point, and the show makes a point of putting a button on this in the final episode as well. And for me, that is kind of what makes the show feel really glorious, because it is about what you choose to do with what's given to you. That religion can be a glorious thing, if used correctly, but it can also be a dreadful thing if used wrongly. And the blood of this vampire, is taken by this guy, and he puts his own frames of reference on it and uses it. And then as we continue in the show, we'll learn that there's some quite selfish reasons for doing what he's doing that have very little to do with religion whatsoever. He wants to restore his past love. And I think, again, that is what makes this show feel so full, is that the humans are subject to this supernatural force. But as someone says in the final episode, you still have a choice. You can still fight against your instincts if you just apply yourself to it.
Yeah, there's a really nice moment. In the fourth episode, I believe this is when Paul finally kind of becomes incapable, or Pruitt, as we now know him, becomes kind of incapable of containing what he's become, and kills and drinks from Joe in a horrible scene of, again, like I saw an interview with Hamish Linklater about this, who's not really done horror before, and this scene where he's sort of cradling Joe's body in his hands, but is just lapping blood from his fractured skull, is just like a cat, is horrible and kind of amazing at the same time as a depiction of vampirism.
It reminded me of a similar scene in, I'm trying to remember the name, the Guillermo del Toro movie from the early 90s. I can't remember the name of it, but it has an old man licking blood off a bathroom floor, which is similarly horrifying. And
then the kind of key bits of we're obviously we haven't really talked about Mildred and Sarah very much. Sarah's the doctor, and the relationship that Paul appears to have with Mildred. I have to admit, I did see the kind of Mildred de-aging thing coming, because their aging up makeup isn't peerless in
Oh,
terms
it's
of
so stupid. You see her in the
it's
first
like,
episode and you go, well, there's a character who's going to get younger because that's
yeah,
clearly a 25-year-old woman.
yeah, it is. I still kind of love the kind of slight staginess of that, but that's a guilty pleasure rather than an actual like good job everybody thing.
If you see True Detective Series 3, the aging makeup they've given for Mahershala Ali in that it's like a thing where you see it and you go, oh, that's how you do it. Like
Right.
that's the first time someone's done it so well. Yeah. Anyway, very, very
But
badly done here.
yeah, it is badly done here. Also, in the flash forwards where Hamish Linklater is aged up to be Pruitt in Jerusalem, you also get the kind of like, that man looks like Hamish Linklater wearing a lot of makeup. Oh,
You could have just got an old man.
He could have just got an old man. But because I appreciate there's a lot to get through, but we start to see, we get to in this episode now that we know it's vampires. Everybody, we get to know a bit more about that. But the thing that's kind of I really enjoyed about this episode, that's a really big subversion, is Bev and the mayor and Sturge the handyman coming across Father Pruitt, and actually Bev has figured out who he is already. Coming across him having just killed Joe and going, well, we're gonna have to cover this up, rather than that like the fact that this was almost this instantaneous like cabal formed in that moment, right? And I think something that I thought was really fun about it is how it has fun with the notion of like thralldom as well. Bev at this moment effectively becomes thrall to the vampire, which is a trope that goes back to Dracula, really, in that kind of she's the Renfield in this story, but it happens completely naturally and without trauma. For her, it's just, and this is again to what you were saying about the power of the wrong kind of faith to excuse anything. She looks at this person who has just done this tremendously evil thing and says, well, that's God. And then begins this process of elevating him to the status of sort of Messiah. And more than that, you have this then sense that they almost adopt and kind of supplicate themselves to the predatory nature of faith, that the flock, literally the flock, is being divided into wolves and sheep before their eyes. And that is accepted as not just a kind of inevitability, but a good thing and a true thing. There's that phrase good and true that kind of gets repeated a few times in the show, which is a really interesting juxtaposition of words and actually an articulation of, like, I think, what's so horrible about that moment where they look at, because crucially, Pruitt, John, Paul, feels shame and regret and fear in that moment until he doesn't, until he believes that it's been purged from him by God. And that's like, it's so rich. I really, really think it's a very clever piece
it's
of
sort of
kind of
textures of Lord of the Flies as well, in that kind of tendency to arrange yourself into a pattern where there is the kind of lead figure and then the enforcer and then the kind of zealot, and kind of how easily human beings seem to succumb to those things, to those patterns when we see something like this.
It's interesting because I hadn't picked up on this. Obviously, I wouldn't have done the first time I watched it, but rewatching the opening beach scene from episode 2, the mayor explicitly says about the cats on the Narrows. I think it's the Narrows. It's like Lord of the Flies for them out there, and that scene is explicitly about the cats are all dead, and the next step is to burn them. And so it's not subtle what that's foretelling. There's, but I thought I thought there's like a strong line of that, and it seems obviously very intentional.
And that's very good as well, because in this episode as well, we finally meet the angel, and the angel is going to do exactly, well, treating the angel like an angel rather than the vampire. It clearly is. Big fingers. It's treating the humans on this island exactly as it did the cats. It's such. I love how much of a disgusting monster it is. Just a hungry.
It's like no amount of Pruitt putting hats on it is going to make it less of a monster.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very good. I really like the sequences where it's dressed up in the church later down the line, and it's doing a very good sort of dog trying not to steal a biscuit off a table acting.
Yeah. I think that's what I love about it, because, normally when we have vampires in fiction, or, a kind of Dracula type vampire at least, we have a creature, often what they stand in for is like everything that is predatory and antisocial about being a human being, and consciously so, right? If you have a werewolf as sort of a kind of feral, predatory, murderous streak within human nature that is then given kind of like uncontrollable voice through these transformations, and you have vampires as typically the sort of the structured aristocratic form of that, the kind of the violence inherent to malicious power rendered in an intelligent body, like, and this combination of animalistic violence and then sophistication. And I love
don't forget horniness as well, which they also
right, yeah, but that's also tied into the right sort of like this sort of conflation of id and intelligence, right? Like, there's nothing scarier than our baser passions indulged with a kind of a sophisticated air. And in this, one thing I love about this version of Vampirism is it's completely split. You have Pruitt on one side and the angel on the other, and the angel is explicitly pretty much an animal, right? Like, as you say, it's a dog trying not to steal a sausage off the table. And the show basically is saying, like, you can put a hat on this thing, but you're not changing it. You know what I mean? Like, there's the show creates questions that it doesn't answer in terms of like how Pruitt really communicates with it, or how they establish an understanding, or how he convinces it to get in a box. But his sort of struggle to control it, like, and this episode is the one that ends with, against the backdrop, Riley figures out that Pruitt's lying about Joe's disappearance, and he goes to confront him at the rec center. Their meetings have gotten to a point of tension over this. Well, there's a lovely moment where their one-on-one AA meetings get to a point where they're almost in accord with one another, until Riley catches what was obviously a lie about Joe. And then he decides not to go meet Erin, who he's had that conversation about death with, but to go just find out what's going on with Paul, and just walks in on the angel decanting its blood into the chalice, and immediately gets full-on jump scared to death. And full-on creepypasta style. And that is, I really like, kind of, this is again one of those like moments of escalation where we just sort of abruptly lose, it seems, a significant point of view character, because of the inevitable impossibility of containing this huge long-fingered secret, and the effect that it's rapidly, and its impact, the fact that the notion that its impact on people, Pruitt's secret, is uncontrollable, right?
Yes.
Like, he has invited a serious predator into their midst, and literally a wolf into the flock, and all he can do is do a surprised Pikachu face at what happens next.
I love, because he's in the rec center and he's kind of going mad from thirst. He's run out of the vampire blood to put in the Eucharist wine, which is what he's been doing. And it's one of the coolest moments in the show, because the camera is in that rec center and sort of on him, and then it just tilts, and the vampire is there with a hat on in the doorway, and it walks through the room. And fills up the Eucharist. And I think it's the first time you sort of properly see it. Now, you've seen it in the flashbacks, but you haven't sort of seen it wandering around with a hat on. And I love that bit. That's great. And then the timing of it, Riley comes upon this scene, and then it jumps at him, and you're right, it's a very good creepypasta jump scare, because it just sort of flies literally right at us. Brilliant ending.
There's a few beats I think we've that are important here actually as well, which is that throughout the island as well at this time, this sort of steady sense, as we come to understand, oh god, it's a vampire, this is all very bad, the island is starting to deal with the positive effects of having been fed vampire blood, right? Like, Riley's dad gets his mojo back in quite a significant way. There's people are being healed, people are feeling better, and then in all of that, and it's a really significant moment, and again, a horrible moment, Erin loses her baby, but she doesn't just lose her baby. It's like she was never pregnant. She just, she wakes up one day. She actually sees the vampire briefly in the window, and then when she goes in for her next, she feels strange. When she goes in for her next scan, the baby is gone. And I find this one of the saddest moments in the show when you as the audience begin to clock what has happened, and then it's then explained by Sarah, the doctor, and the doctor on the mainland as well, that to the human body in that moment, the unborn child is an alien presence. Basically, it is an external presence, and so this kind of quote unquote healing vampire magic blood is having the effect of causing Erin's body to, heavy quotes, restore itself. And in doing so, this horrible tragedy takes place. And I think that's a really crucial beat, because it's right in the heart of the middle of the show. It's obviously central to her character and where her character will go next, and the heartbreak, and it actually is the thing that leads to that conversation about death between her and Riley. But also, really crucially, it's one of the key ways that shows that what Pruitt is bringing into the island is unnatural. And a lot of as we get into the second half of the show, a lot of that's been articulated is about endings, right? This island is ending before we get to know it. There's Monsignor Pruitt, there's a line about how he should have, he was a lot sicker than people thought he should have died. There's this notion about accepting natural patterns of birth and death and endings, and that what the sort of deathless figure, this concept of deathlessness that Pruitt and his faith has brought into the island is deeply unnatural, and therefore disconnected from the real needs of the people he believes he is serving. And I find that the set scenes with Erin quite hard anyway, but also I think they're really necessary because of the way they start to show the way that this, whatever it is, you're not quite sure at this point what Pruitt is actually trying to do, but the way that whatever he is trying to do is, I was going to say sort of like, contrary to humanity in a way, but it is also sort of equally in that moment, obviously contrary to the show's understanding of God as well. And I think it's interesting as that whole sort of theme develops, how it sort of positions in the way that you articulated about that conversation about death, how actually a lot of these sort of characters with greater empathy arrive at some of the similar conclusions, except where this power is introduced that ultimately kind of corrupts and twists that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I agree. I found that scene where her baby has just sort of vanished from her womb. It was very, very frightening prospect, and I think the person writing it likely, or someone involved has likely had some experience of something like that, because I think it felt very true. And I think the way she processes it later is very, very moving. And another good example of how the show, because her conception of how, heaven works at this moment, it feels plausible. It feels close to us. And the character she's talking to Riley about it, and he is listening to her in rapt attention at what she's saying. He's not disregarding what she's saying. He's not even necessarily not believing in it, even though he doesn't. And I think, I don't know, there's something extraordinarily honest about that moment.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's really crucial is that, particularly as we get into the next episode, is really the show, I think, has probably more than four key characters whose empathy allows them to start passing back and forwards across this bridge between, faith and a more humanitarian outlook, or have the many different ways the show cuts it. Erin, Riley, Sheriff Hassan, and also Pruitt himself, except for the fact that Pruitt is the one with the keys to all of that divine power, both literally in his access to the vampire, but also through his kind of oratorical skill. And what's really interesting is you have the scene in the fifth episode where he delivers his first like truly fire and brimstone sermon, right? The soldiers of God speech, which is sort of, you can see, is driving the town to the point, to the edge, really. This is against the backdrop of Riley's disappearance, and it alienates Mildred, who is getting younger by the day, who is clearly the woman. You know, it's building to this revelation that it will get to, that Mildred and Pruitt had a relationship in the past, and the outcome of that relationship was Sarah. You know, and it alienates her, and it creates this split in his character between what it is that he's actually there to do, if he was honest with himself, and the performance, again, to return to that word, that he is conducting around it, and now being supported in conducting by Bev and her particular malign faith, and Sturge and his loyalty, the mayor and his fear. And these are all sort of like, it's really telling to me that this, you know, episode, which is also about the kind of the beginning of a, as they say, a new gospel, a new set of apostles, has at its center that the deep hypocrisy that is created in many ways by Pruitt's empathy and his humanity. And that's that theme is going to come out more and more and more, but I find it really, really kind of engaging to go back to it.
I liked, you know, in his speeches in this episode where he's talking about, you know, prepare for war as soldiers in God's army. And it's funny, just last night I was watching a documentary, which is on HBO, called Exterminate All the Brutes, which is a really good documentary about the history of colonialism. And it talks about how the very idea of religious crusade was in fact an enterprise for money. They wanted to open up trade routes to the east and dominate them, and racial purity was this sort of fringe benefit of it. And in that documentary, the filmmaker traces the founding of the Spanish Inquisition to find out, you know, whether Jews were really converting and Muslims were really converting, as the kind of fundamental foundation of blood purity in culture in Western civilization and stuff like that. And I you know, and obviously that the Catholic Church was at the center of all that. And so when a guy stands up and starts talking about, you know, soldiers in God's army, you know, very, very unnerving to see. And you've lost, I think, all of that power that you're feeling from him earlier on in the show. I'm not along for this ride, you know, and lots of people in his congregation are feeling uncertain about it too. Yeah, I just thought that was an interesting, you know, when you start talking about God's war, as soon as someone says that, it's very frightening, even though it's all there in the Bible. They quote it at length.
And it's also what it's covering for. And I think so. This episode has, like, the ending of this episode, I think, is my favorite thing in any Mike Flanagan show. So Riley vanishes for most of this episode. Erin is looking for him. Well, we obviously know he's been attacked by Mr. Longfingers, the spooky hat wearing vampire, the angel, and then, but in his absence, you know. Paul is kind of rising to this, you know, rhetorical height. And again, as you say, getting more distant from you. And I think that's also, as the viewer, and I think that's represented in the show by the distance this is creating between him and Mildred, who is obviously more and more important character to him. And I think that represents the distance from his own humanity. And then you have Riley's reappearance on Erin's doorstep. He takes her out in a boat, and Riley's been having these repeated dreams where he's alone in a boat. Actually, I think my first clue that this was going to be a vampire show was that when he explains that dream and he says that he always wakes up before it gets light. I was like, oh, that's what's going to happen to him.
Yeah.
I sort of saw that coming, but I assumed it would be the last scene of the whole show, actually. No. I didn't think it would be 2 episodes from the end. And he takes Erin out in a boat, and then through flashback, or through, you know, he tells her the story. We see this through flashback. He tells the story about waking up in the rec center, now a vampire, being sort of induced into this coven. You know, that Bev doesn't really want him there because she sees him as kind of godless. But Pruitt is nothing but gracious and inclusive and takes care of him fatherly, both with a capital F and a lowercase f. And he rejects it. And I love this ending for this character because it's so ambiguous until the end, and it almost. This is one thing I think is really strong about this show is it has many depictions of capital F faith, to go with that, and also lowercase faith. And And this is something that and it tests your ability to have faith in Riley and who you believe him to be. This is someone who is wrestling with guilt for the young woman he killed in a drink driving accident, who is literally haunted by her. He is the only person who really possesses a ghost in the traditional sense in this, and that she shows up in his vision, but not necessarily in a real way, or so on. We'll get to that. He's haunted by her. He is wrestling with this. He is also doing this work through AA of trying to fix himself, and specifically trying to fix himself without the assistance of faith that he has lost. It's implied at the beginning of the show, when he is sentenced, he accepts his imprisonment and he's told he will be served either 4 to 10 years. And almost immediately the show says 4 years later, which sort of, indicates that he's let out early. Whatever you think about whether that's appropriate or not, the point is he is sort of single-mindedly focused, it appears, on literally conquering this part of himself that he loathes and that he associates with so much deep regret, both for the life that he took, the life he never had with Erin, all of these things. And very much a lot of that centers around his ability to conquer his own addiction. And what this means is you have this character, and the performance of Riley is really specific because he's like he is a handsome man, but he was folded and crumpled in on himself almost all of the time, including when he goes to see Erin and he asks for this last conversation. And then there is the moment in the boat where she articulates, like, why did you take me here? Why did you tell me this story that she doesn't believe? Why have you separated me? If you're trying to frighten me, I've been frightened worse by worse, because she has, suffered terribly at the hands of men as well. And then what it kind of reveals about him is this really profound inner strength that he can conquer his addiction, and initially to alcohol, but now to blood. And as pat as that sounds, it puts a completely different light on Pruitt. It exposes him as someone who can't conquer his addictions or his wants, who actually doesn't have the strength to do the right thing. And Riley makes no attempt to justify it to himself. And but I love the moment at the end where he basically just says, I came here on this little rowboat out to sea to isolate myself, and because and I love the moment where he says to Erin, I want you to run away. I know you're going to row back and try and help them, so you need to know the truth of this. And then as the sun rises, he then sees the young woman that he killed sitting in the boat opposite him, now completely restored, smiling at him. And then it cuts to Erin screaming and screaming and screaming as he combusts and collapses in the sun. And then that screaming continues over the credits for like 3 minutes. It's horrible.
Yeah.
And that whole moment I found, like, the show goes for another 2 episodes, and I think goes some really powerful places. But a lot of the show's humanity, I think, is bundled up in that moment through Riley, and giving him this sort of heroic ending in a way that comes not from his ability to kill the vampire, apart from himself actually in that moment, but through his ability to conquer his sort of selfish need, like his selfishness, in a way that Pruitt can't, to understand something about the people he loves that Pruitt doesn't, and then do the right thing. And then in that final moment where he, his death vision of the woman he killed is almost explicitly a "Hey buddy, welcome to heaven" moment.
Yeah, just as she starts to lift him up. Yeah, that's when we cut to her perspective.
Yeah, and this is juxtaposed with the fact that his vampire sight that lets him see blood and light in particular ways creates this sort of radiant sense of the cosmos as well. And in this one moment, like, the door is just suddenly flung open to any number of possible, afterlife scenarios, in the same way that his sort of fairly scientific understanding of death and Erin's initially sort of highly Christian sense of death intermingle as they talk to one another. In his last moments, he gets both as well, and he's the only character to get that, I think, apart from Erin herself. And I just think it's as scary as it is, and as horrible as it is in that moment. It's also such a kind of it almost feels like quite a kind of sort of defiant victory for this character.
Yeah, it's glorious, I think.
They
do clever things with time, so you're not necessarily expecting it. I know you were because you're savvy to it. But they do a very clever job of you're not necessarily expecting the sun to rise, or at least I wasn't at that moment. But then, of course, it does, and it's with glorious finality and inevitability, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's like it also tees us up for the end of the show, right? Like that's where it's going.
I would also say about those rec center scenes in this episode where Pruitt is kind of giving him the lowdown on what this is all about, and telling him, he gets him to feed and then says, "Do you feel at peace? And if you feel at peace, then doesn't that tell you that you're doing the Lord's work?" And that is the kind of that is the kind of lie that Pruitt keeps trying to sell to him, that he doesn't feel any guilt. And we were talking about this in the Deep Space Nine pod last week, actually, like being troubled by the fact you don't feel guilt and why you should or shouldn't be troubled by that. And I think it was fascinating because I think one of the definitions you could make of a cult is that they give you one experience whilst telling you it's another. One way or another, they sell a lie to you, and then sort of put you in a position where you're going to interpret that in a certain way. And vampirism in this, when he's sort of out looking at the lights and stuff like that, is psychedelic. It's a sort of drug experience. And the fact that he's been in AA as part of his own journey and trying to stay off another drug, again, I think that, as you were saying, basically, it just all adds to the triumph that this guy has learned enough in his life to be strong enough to resist this particular cult's influences.
It puts paid to the notion of easy solutions, which is going to be really crucial going towards the end. Right?
Yes.
Like it's there isn't without, and I think this is really crucial, particularly as we get into the next episode and the sort of scientific explanations for things. It doesn't then, but it also doesn't close the door on faith, and I think that's really important. I think we both feel the same way about this, that having this be ultimately like a faith versus science thing, or a religion versus secularism thing, would be a huge misfire. It sort of articulates that ultimately, I think, sort of empathy and meaningful work, and also acceptance of the line that keeps coming up, the wisdom to accept the things you can't change, right? This line that Pruitt keeps repeating to Riley is really important to the show, and it's something that is the absolute core of Pruitt's hypocrisy.
And Riley does surrender himself to a higher power. He surrenders himself to the sun, the highest of all powers.
Right. Yeah. The literally the unconquered sun. And I could go on about this all day. But there's I think a very humane understanding of the role that faith plays in those moments, as well as the role that the person to person empathy and meaningful hard work plays in getting a good outcome, even if a good outcome ends in 3 minutes of screaming in this case.
Yep.
So, I mean, with Riley gone, then we get into the last two episodes, really. We get into the kind of the run of the ending, which is going to be very much like, welp, we got ourselves a big vampire problem and a cult problem.
I mean, you did sort of hint on it just then, but I do think you're probably right that at the end of episode 5 is the kind of apotheosis, of this show. And I think I got thoughts and feelings on the last two episodes. I still think they're very good. I think the show is, a very literate horror show. And I think what happens now is it kind of changes direction, because up to this point it's been, and forgive me because I am a genre fan and I don't mean to disparage horror at all, but I feel like it's been from a kind of literary world pressing into the horror world. It's kind of, it's starting with the characters, and I think you could probably define literary fiction as some kind of, an attempt to engage with the complications of human emotions and time and perspective and stuff like that. Not that horror fiction doesn't, but I think literary fiction is a particular sort of way of doing that. And what I feel like in these last two episodes is it comes at it from the other side. We're very much increasingly in an, oh God, vampires, zombie movie. And I still think there's glorious stuff in there, and the characters are still there too. But I don't know, there's almost like a polarity change in how the show operates from this point onward, which I'm less enamored with, although I still think it, as I say, a lot to say for it.
I think this is something that has is also the case in some of the other Flanagan shows as well. It happens. I like this version of it more because the rules are a little simpler, and I think because the a lot of the decisions that get made sort of make sense, although it starts to fray at the edges a little bit. We effectively have our Scooby Gang form, basically, right? Like the league of people who aren't quite sure about this assemble. Sarah, her rejuvenated mother Mildred, Erin, who now has the kind of truth of things, and then later the sheriff, the kids, right? We have our kind of gang of heroes basically at this point, and they start their plan to kind of to burn the boats, to kind of flee, to kind of trap the townspeople, to kind of avoid what's coming next. And then you have obviously like the big revelation as Paul reveals himself to be Pruitt, introduces the angel to a terrified and locked in church congregation, and then the kind of, you're talking about cult imagery. There's nothing about like a kind of, the drinking poison in a church to ascend is as explicit as this show gets in that regard, right? Like this, I find that scene very hard, right? Like the
very, very frightening, I thought. It's
very frightening. Like people being told that if they kill themselves, they'll be reborn in God's army, basically, as a vampire, because that's the mechanics of it and how it works. And the sort of like steady escalation of this moment, the fact that it is ultimately going to rip Mildred, Sarah, and Pruitt apart, even though he's done it for them. The kind of rapid deaths of many characters, but also, as you say, the kind of emergence of that kind of like action horror kind of survival scenario out of this. There's a line where, and I don't hate it, but it is there. It is. I have some thoughts about it where Bev stops the kind of Scooby Gang from escaping the church and says, she hasn't killed herself yet. And actually, one thing I really like about this is how you start to see her actual fear of death, right? Like the sort of some of the emptiness of her own, that underneath her external, kind of almost like cartoonish didacticism, there's a lot of deep fears and doubts. And it's like, sort of God really doesn't kind of walk with her, making her feel better, giving her support.
Yeah, she's doing a run.
She's terrified. She tries to run and then, blocks the passage of the other characters who are trying to escape and says, if you shoot, if you kill me, I'll be back in 5 minutes, right? She'll be reborn. And Erin shoots her and says, "We've got 5 minutes," which is very funny. But it's also like it's almost a bit too hard of a one-liner. You know what I mean? It's almost like we gain like, I think it's probably the show's first bant.
Yeah, it's a very low on bant show, really.
It is really low bant, and then we get this kind of like, she doesn't like, twirl the gun in her hands and reholster it, but there is a kind of moment of like, well, like we've settled into our genre now, giddy up, it's cowboy time.
Let's go, Buffy. I mean, Erin.
Yeah, exactly. That said, but also actually part of me was kind of, I find myself almost like grateful for the catharsis of this whole sequence in a way. Not in terms of the fact that it's a whole lot of fun to watch people getting slaughtered and their town burnt down, but there's a sense of like all of that powder keg tension has now detonated, right? And you're watching the individual pieces fall where they may, literally watching the ash fall, which is like a recurring thing.
Yes, and lots. I mean, like this is how most Stephen King books end, I think. Mm-hmm. And I enjoyed that, I have to say. Like in the adaptations that they've done of King's sort of epic town goes wrong type books, these bits tend to be kind of less important. Mm-hmm. And also the characters are never as richly drawn as you'd like them to be. And I did like seeing our Scooby Gang, against the odds here, particularly as hopeless as it begins to seem as well, with all the fires and all the death and all the zombies and all that going on. It's there is catharsis in it. I think that church scene isn't cathartic, it's just horrible.
Yeah, I agree.
And the fact that there's sort of rolling people dying and then resurrecting and then killing other people and all that kind of stuff. I found that, again, it's a very true feeling scene. That kind of enclosed panic, enclosed chaos, claustrophobia. Mm-hmm. It felt like, lots. It felt like a very true examination of the worst of humanity, to be honest. And the one-liner in the vestry afterwards is probably doesn't chime necessarily that well with the brutality of that, but it does sort of announce what's going to happen next, which is lots of running around in the dark and shouting.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is it's literally the starting gun for the kind of the Left 4 Dead level that will follow. You know what I mean? Like, and but in a way, it's like, I think one of the things that genre can do here is offer you that kind of like, but particularly these long burn TV horror shows, I think, and this is actually, I think, one of the things that's hard going about Hill House sometimes is it's a long time to spend tense. You know,
Yeah,
a movie might get this from you for 90 minutes to 2 hours. This show gets it from you for 10, and I think you almost need this moment where like where the tension releases and you start to see the consequences of things, and you almost gain the same clarity that the characters do in terms of like, well, this is what we've got to do. And in a way, all of these characters are Scooby Gang. The thing that's key about them is they all resolve to die, basically. They all resolve to face their own deaths and save, you know. The one thing I don't like here is they kind of explicitly say, well, we have to save the world, right? Like, if this stuff gets to the mainland, it's the end of everything. I find that a bit grand to some extent. Like, I think it doesn't really need that, you know? It's like, it's enough for it to have to die with the island, right?
Yeah, it feels a little bit Jurassic Park, that, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Yeah, actually, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's like there's that logic that it can't, you know. But this is a trope of zombie movies normally, right? Like that sort of we need to kind of walk into annihilation rather than allow the kind of unnatural force of undeath to spread any further, because it is inevitably going to get everywhere. But just that aside, I quite like that moment where it's like all those characters realize, well, we're fucked, basically. But also the thing to do here is what Riley did, right? Like, resist it, and then have this almost like structured scientific approach, clinical approach. It's I don't think an accident that it's the doctor who kind of is really central to a lot of this planning. Clinical approach to cauterizing this wound, this kind of unnatural thing that's occurred, that is enabled and supported by the faith and the humanity of the characters doing it, right? And the love they have for each other and their place. And that is the faith. That is Erin's faith. It's her kind of growing sense of the universe. It's Pruitt's faith, indeed, as it kind of finally reasserts itself right at the end, and he realizes that what he's doing is deeply wrong. It's Hassan's faith as well, and that, I think, is a really key like marriage of the two, right? The solution to this, to the extent that it is, comes from all of this and through empathy and humanity, rather than it being a victory of one over the other.
Yes, I mean, he has a lovely, in his "Hi, my name's Steve, and this is what I'm all about" scene. He talks about, working in the police in New York following 9/11 and becoming part of the kind of anti-terrorism sort of push at the time, and then that turning on him and him becoming, it's a kind of argument he makes for non-intervention, for keeping yourself out and staying quiet and staying subservient for your own safety, which he then contradicts in these final episodes by being, a real hero and running into the fight in the way that he kind of originally intended to after 9/11. He wanted to be the hero, or he wanted to do good, and then it was kind of taken away from him by mistrust.
And explicitly by racism. And I think there's a real Rahul Kohli's really interesting in the way he articulates kind of what he was thinking about this performance, particularly, and he's just very interesting on the subject of his performances anyway. But there's an interesting thing with Hassan where like he explicitly is the gunslinger from out of town in this show. Like, I was kind of joking about like the kind of Western element to it towards the end, but he has the kind of the bearing and the swagger of a kind of man with no name type, or a kind of the lawmaker who comes into this, the lawman who comes into this sort of powder keg and finds himself at the heart of it, but is kept on the fringe of it by explicitly by sort of racism and mistrust. And as you say, makes this case for why he's had to make this decision to sort of parlay with those forces for the safety of his son, basically. And then seeing him get his hero moment in the church, really, where he will not sit down and take it, where he will not stand by. And what happens to him is really horrible, as it is to most characters. And the fact that he's betrayed by his son is really hard, I think, to watch. But I think it's sort of I really liked the way the show sort of asserts and reasserts not just Sheriff Hassan's like strength and conviction to do the right thing, but his sort of dignity in that all the way to the end. And dignity is something that he talks about explicitly. And the fact that it is a heroic sort of dignity in a place that the people of Crockett Island, because of their racism in this case, do not think they will find it. And that, I think, is key to be honest, I think that is then the key theme that binds all of our kind of eventual heroes, basically.
Yes, and it's interesting that they all draw their strength from something true and real and tangible in their lives, rather than something that they can't see or touch, And you get to see Bev in the final episode at one point, drinking out of someone's neck like an animal, which is a great moment for her, actually, where she's sort of stalking around telling everyone what to do, and then seeing her overcome with hunger. And actually, it's Flynn's mum, isn't it? That she, sorry, not Flynn, Riley's mum, that she pounces on and eats.
Riley's. Talk about that. Like, and also like her very end. I think we're conflating the last two episodes here a little bit, but that's probably fine. Like her very ending, where like she almost walks to the beach to die in the sunlight with dignity, and then starts to dig in the sand. Like,
I loved Bev digging a hole.
Like, say, the dog she murdered earlier. And like, but the sort of the moment of that of like, is this show going to give Bev some dignity in the end? Wait a minute, are you talking about dog murderer Bev Keane? Absolutely not. Like, and it's not subtle, but it is entertaining.
Yes. I mean, I think we can talk about these last couple of episodes together, because basically everything goes crazy. Everyone's killing each other. Everyone's murdering each other. There's lots of double crossings. All of our characters die apart from two. Everyone dies in this show apart from two people, Lisa and Warren, who managed to row out to kind of watch this thing go up in flames as it does. The Scooby Gang kind of perform their plan to basically burn all the buildings so that there's nowhere to shelter from the sunlight, and everyone dies in various appalling ways. Beyond that, you have Pruitt, who manages to kind of wrest back his humanity. It's a really interesting turn for his character. He sort of looks upon all this chaos and horror, and again, he finally manages to find that strength that very few other characters in this show, are able to have from when they're properly full-blown vampire monsters. I love the scene between him and Erin, because Erin is his daughter from the affair he had. Sorry, Sarah. Is it Sarah who's his daughter?
Sarah's his daughter, yeah.
Sarah's his daughter, yeah, from an affair he had with Mildred, yeah. And he says, it never felt like a sin. Our daughter was never a sin. And I love that line from him, because even in, the fact that he was a priest having an affair with a woman and, she bore a child, and he never felt like that was a sin. That to me kind of was the goodness in his character that kind of stopped him from going quite the way of Bev in all this. And even though he has wrought terrible things on very many people, you do get a sense of the conflict of the old man as well. Yeah. In this younger body that humanizes him more than I thought possible, actually.
Yes, and I think that's the key to him, right? Like, so his last scene, like, to talk about last scenes, he kind of, I've just said her name and completely blanked on it. Sarah's mum, Mildred, shoots him, right?
She shoots him. Yeah,
she shoots him. He gets killed she then gets killed by the angel. Yeah. This is where it starts to crumble for him, because his vampire best friend has just killed his actual love of his life.
And the reason he did it, he confesses that she was the reason he brought the vampire back was to restore her to youth.
And then as he goes to confront Sarah, who's about to burn down the church, and then Sturge shoots Sarah, who is killed, and Sarah doesn't go to church, so she just dies. She doesn't become a vampire. And
She
and
spits
this
out
leaves,
the blood, yeah.
yeah, oh yeah, because he tries to save her, and she rejects it, which is obviously crucial. And then the three, he takes her body down to the bridge that Sarah used to play on when she was a kid, and the three of them, are there in the sunset together, and he explicitly takes his collar off and throws it into the water. And I think the really crucial thing with Pruitt is, and this is at least my reading of it, but I think this is text to the extent that it's text in the shows, is the key thing with him is he was never that devout. Clearly, he had an affair. He fell in love, had an affair, and what he is, and actually he's also pretty deeply empathetic. Like you see this with Riley, you see it throughout the show. It's one of the reasons he's so compelling. But he has access through his position, through his power of oratory, to summon this sort of didactic power into being and sort of use it for his will, and to exert his will. And he lies to himself about his real reason for bringing the vampire to the island. Right, his reason for doing it is because he regrets his life. He wants another chance at life with the woman he loves and the daughter that he loves as well. And these are ultimately selfish human things, to the extent that Riley was also a selfish human in a large part of his life. And I think, you could say that he loses his faith at the end. I don't think it does. I think he finally takes off the costume at the end. And he is revealed that there's this, Bev is devoted to him, but she's devoted to an image he's projecting. And that hypocrisy is doomed this entire island, right? To the extent that he gets or deserves a redemption arc. I don't think he really gets one. I think where he gets is a moment of honesty at the end, which humanizes him, but reveals the ways in which his empathy was ultimately sort of failed in the face of the power at his disposal. For some reason, the phrase, and he almost then, I think he's one of the ones that realizes the reality of the kind of bestial power that he's brought into their midst. The phrase that won't go out of my brain that I think was in my head after I saw the show and I was thinking about it was, for all my chat, that's just a vampire in a hat.
Absolutely.
Which is that's the underlying message of Father Monsignor Pruitt in this show. I do find that quite touching, even though you should be angry with him, right? Like his inability in a way, or the fact that he was not really allowed by the town people who were devoted to him to almost die with dignity as old Monsignor Pruitt. His chance encounter with this power that let him potentially do something about it led him to do a apocalyptically awful thing in the pursuit of something that he thought was good. And I think that is an important counterpoint to the fate of the characters that don't have that kind of power, but use the power that they do have to then close this wound that is created.
Yeah, I will say, just because I think it's pertinent to the sort of the last sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes of the final episode, is that music in the show is really good. They use lots of Neil Diamond for some reason. It's a really unusual choice. Like, I wonder if there's something to do with like him being a Jewish, a famously Jewish sort of perspective singer-songwriter, or something to do with that, to kind of bring a kind of that into the show. And also all the use of hymns and spiritual songs and stuff like that. Nearer My God to Thee, which he uses pretty obsessively over the course of the first half of the show. It comes in and out quite a lot. And then he drops it away, and I'm saying sort of Mike Flanagan working with his composer, he drops it away to kind of, and in these final episodes, it just sort of tinkles through. It's really interesting, the score suggesting it, but never actually playing it until Flynn's parents start singing it after they realize that they have a choice not to be disgusting vampire monsters. And the whole final section of the show is scored by the townspeople singing it. And I love Nearer My God to Thee. It's such a wonderful tune, and it underpins the kind of final moments of the show beautifully. I think Erin, who basically sacrifices herself to the angel, who has revealed himself more than ever to be a really just disgusting monster in this final, you literally see it just feeding on people, and when they try and attack it, it doesn't even notice them. It's just this hungry motherfucker. And when it's feeding on her, the sort of loving way it's cradling her head as it does so, I thought was so disgusting. And she lets it do it as she slashes its wings to stop it from flying away.
Which is this culmination of her arc, right, where she was sort of told by her abusive mother that she had clipped her mother's wings by existing. And there's a book ending there. And again, that is maybe sometimes too neat. I wonder what you made of Erin's final monologue, because I think something that, it's a show of many monologues, and her final one, I think, is the last significant, bit of dialogue of the show. It's not the last line of the show, but it's close to. And it's a very long meditation on death, this time kind of unifying Riley's, previous kind of humanist position with Erin's more previously explicitly religious position. I have watched it a few times now. I'd be interested to know what you thought of it, particularly at that moment in the show.
Honestly, I thought it was fucking glorious. I mean, I'm almost tearing up thinking about it right now. I mean, I kind of, when it was, because she delivers it in a recreation of the scene she had earlier, where it's a kind of different version of it. Fleeting little dreamlets printed on the tissue of my dying brain, and I am the lightning that jumps between. I am the energy firing the neurons, and I'm returning. And I'm just another bit. We are the cosmos dreaming of itself. It's simply a dream that I think is my life every time, but I'll forget this. I always do. I always forget me. I always forget my dreams. I kind of expect myself to dislike it, for me to think it's too much. And there's a weird abstract way to talk about myself, but I was surprised by how taken in by it I was. I just think it's glorious poetry, and it feels so true, even if, maybe it is just, pseuds. I don't know. I kind of, the way it's delivered with the nearer my God to thee in there, and the intercutting between her dying and between the scene with her and
Riley
and Riley and just all that stuff. I was completely knocked out by it. There is no time, there is no death. Life is a dream, it's a wish made again and again and again and again and again, on into eternity. And I am all of it. I am everything. I am all. I am that I am. Yeah, for some reason, it stole my heart.
Thing is, because I'm glad to hear that, because I had a slightly tricky relationship with it, and I keep having a slightly tricky relationship with it, which is not stylistic, because I think it is a beautifully written and delivered monologue. And maybe this is going to be a little bit arch, but forgive me. Like, what she does is she slashes the angel's wings to prevent it from escaping, right? To force it to burn up in the sun, even as it tries to escape. And there's this notion of, throughout the show, of who will escape this island, right? And the answer is ultimately the kids to some extent, but then in many ways, none of them, except Erin, who in that moment, that's that monologue that ends with "I am that I am." She effectively becomes God, because she's describing becoming one with God, right? Becoming one with the universe, and to some extent, the difference is semantic. And she sort of she almost spiritually, and in terms of her eloquence and her ability to articulate that the density of that concept, almost sort of rockets out of the show like a meteor for me. It is this sort of very touching kind of act of apotheosis, really. And she gets, and I think the show is right to identify that she's one of the characters who kind of deserves it, given her life experience and things like that, and what she's been through in the show. However, there is a part of me, and this is maybe more personal than anything else, who's a little bit wary of that neatness. Elsewhere in that ending, you have the shot I love, as hard as it is, of Sheriff Hassan and Ali praying on the beach together. Ali has been vampirized himself, and therefore will burn up in the sun. Hassan is dying from a bullet wound, and as they're praying, he just collapses sideways, and that's it. He dies mid-sentence. Similarly, the town people, as they gather and they sing "Near My God to Thee," are cut off kind of beautifully, mid-note by the sun rising, and they burn up, all in the same instant, and it left mid-sentence. The last line of the show is Lisa saying, "I can't feel my legs," which is, kind of indicates that the power of the vampire has kind of left her. It's ultimately a good thing, but it's very bittersweet.
Although I was kind of hoping that they said, "Wow, that really escalated." Instead,
it did, yeah. Yeah, fucking hell, says
what a weekend.
This Warren. Yeah, exactly. And
sorry, I interrupted you. To go on.
No, it's okay. But and then in the midst of that, you get and so you have all of these characters whose fate is either obviously their fate is obviously very certain, apart from the angel themselves, but their last words are cut off, right, or unfinished in some way, or Bev literally ends her life scrabbling to not end. It's all very appropriate. And then Erin in the middle of it gets this soaring monologue, and it really is that kind of projects her, like, as I say, up and away and out of the show, which I find it very moving. And I also find it like, I'm trying to describe this, and this is maybe a very personal response. I almost probably would be more comfortable with no one in the show getting that. Right. With there being more uncertainty left in the world. And the thing it makes me think of, and maybe this is a little personal, but I'll just say it in this. I have a tendency, because I talk a lot as a person generally, to try and tie a bow on things that I'm saying. Probably going to do it at the end of this paragraph. And that means that I can kind of admire and relate to some of the ways that people in these shows express themselves. However, I find it difficult to I find it uncomfortable to not be able to land a thought or a sentence and tie a bow on it. God knows, I get this at the end of therapy sessions of all things, right? That need to kind of tie a bow on something.
Yep, same.
And and I have this bad habit of clock watching when I'm recording anything or talking to someone of well, I need to end this sentence. How do I, maybe it's a writing instinct, I don't know what it is, but how do I package this all up and kind of hand it off into the world so it's not still connected to me in some way. And the way Erin's final monologue wraps up her experience, it really is quite isolated around her. I am that I am. Feels to me like a kind of almost like the final kind of guilty pleasure, that the thing that I should be focused on is actually the imperfect, bittersweet, incomplete endings that are given to every other character, because that is more true to human experiences I live it, or as I kind of encounter it. And hopefully that's not too real, but there's something about that it's maybe the only moment where, given that I normally find the Flanagan monologue as something that gives me access to a side of human experience that I don't always get out of TV generally, that one at the end almost feels like it goes past me off into territory where I can no longer follow it, would be the way I would put it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I love the poetry of it. I mean, I don't think this is how the world works. I don't think she's right about, the way she's describing existence here. And it is a show about dogma and dogma delivered through preaching. And so it is, perhaps a little bit contradictory for it to sell us a piece of very beautiful poetry to round things up. I mean, I do exactly the same thing. I always have it in my head as something like at the end of a children's story. It's and they went home and they had the best fish and chips they'd ever had. And it's that kind of vibe where you want to really hit that final, full stop. And no, I think you're entirely right. I think he gets away with it because the mise-en-scène of it all is so beautiful and numinous. But I do think you're right that actually the show would survive perfectly well with the finality of kind of these stories cut short, but these courageous stories cut short rather than doing. Yeah, Mike, we've all read the final pages of From Hell by Alan Moore. It's. And American showrunners really need to stop stealing from Alan Moore, because we can see it. We can see them when they're doing it. But no, generally, I thought glorious. I love that the angel flies off, hopefully to perish, although we don't actually see it. I like that that's handed to the audience as a hope that it will, or a likelihood. We're expected to have faith in the fact that it will burn up before it can't race the sun. And then the show ends with Lisa and what's his name in the
Warren
in the boat, and she says, I can't feel my legs, and then it just ends. It's that is quite downbeat, you know. It's unusual.
but she's smiling when she says it, which is such a man. But that's the ambiguity I love, right? Because that's when it kind of says all of this stuff, all of this complicated stuff that's been dramatized on this island is part of kind of human experience, right?
Yeah.
That and that it's ultimately a message of literally accepting the things you can't change, and having the wisdom to recognize things that you can.
Yeah.
I think that's because I know that, the broader production history of the thing is that this is I think Midnight Mass was a novel that Mike Flanagan tried to write and then sort of shopped around for a long time before having the kind of support and trust from the success of the other shows to actually make the thing. There are references to it in almost all of his other works that I am aware of. And so it's sort of, I think Midnight Mass is literally a book that one of his other characters is writing in one of his other shows.
Yes, I saw some of that stuff, yeah.
And so, like, it sort of feels like, I think that personal side of it is kind of what ultimately carries it and elevates it for me at the end as well. In addition to, as you say, the kind of like really striking filmmaking.
Yeah, and I think you're right that the show itself comprises just one big Serenity Prayer, really. Serenity Prayer is kind of one of those bits of, I think it's Christian in origin, although I'm sure it's older than that, really, as most of these things are. But, like, it's almost mathematically true. There's no good argument against the Serenity Prayer in the way that there's no good argument against the golden rule of do us to others if you have them do to yourself, And for the show to kind of extend itself over those truisms with such complexity of character and with an ultimate sense of sort of positivism, which I think is probably the charitable way of looking at Aaron's speech. It's a positivism. It's that kind of there's a spark in things. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, as Leonard Cohen said, and I think that is definitely true. And I think. Yeah, I left the show feeling sort of sad and hopeful, which I guess is better than just sad and despairing. Sad and
right,
yeah.
And it's like I think it's sort of that is something that I really appreciate getting from horror, effectively, and it's not always a given. That in kind of exposing the things, in kind of really kind of engaging with the complexity and difficulty, and occasionally pain and fear that come with just being alive, it also kind of takes you by the hand at the end and kind of tells you it's going to be okay, which is like, I'm struggling to wrap this up, I will say. Like, there's, it is ultimately very moving, and I think that's one of the reasons I would recommend it to people who wouldn't necessarily otherwise choose to watch horror.
And it's funny that he's I'm extending it over now. It's funny that he's someone who's only recently recovered from alcoholism. He talks about, but this show has been long since gestating. So I'm sure the fact that he's done 2 successful shows for Netflix make it easier. But it's also interesting that to give himself that final act of the show, he had to resolve his own personal issues, that would sort of send him, to that place where he could finally tell this story. And I'm very glad he did.
Yeah, I am very glad also. And I'm glad we could take the time to discuss it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we should talk about television some more at some point. Maybe absolutely. When Midnight Club comes out, or we'll go watch Doctor Sleep or something. Thank you very much for listening, everybody who has stuck with us. I hope you have... I never know how to wrap these up, these lock-ins. Jamie, do you want to go at it? Talking endings.
Talk about endings. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm just going to say that in isolation. Thank you for staying with us if you have. Hopefully we'll be back for more similarly in-depth chat soon, because they're good fun, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, thank you to everyone who supports the podcast on Patreon. You can find out more about that at patreon.com/Crate and Crowbar. You can find other lock-ins like this one on YouTube, youtube.com/Crate and Crowbar, and on our website at crateandcrowbar.com. It's also where you'll find a link to our Discord, where people discuss many things, mostly video games, but also television, films, all sorts of other subjects about things you can look at on a screen or hold in your hands or just think about as a human being. That's the sum of it. I've been Chris Thurston.
I've been Jamie Britton, and I can't feel my legs.